Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we are diving straight into a historical figure whose shadow literally stretches across millennia, Cyrus the Great. Now we know he founded the massive Persian Achaemenid Empire way back in the 6th century BCE. But what makes Cyrus so absolutely fascinating isn't just the sheer mind-boggling square footage of the empire he conquered, it's how his legacy completely transcends time, culture, and geography. Really think about this for a second. How does one single guy become a hero in the Hebrew Bible, an absolute idol to a Greek conqueror like Alexander the Great, and, somehow, a case study for modern business CEOs? It's wild. There's this incredible tension between the historical reality of the man who died in 530 BCE and the enduring, almost superhuman mythos that built up around him. We're talking about a leader who completely rewired how the ancient world understood power and governance.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the ultimate ancient leader, the real Cyrus cylinder, a biblical savior, Alexander's respect for the tomb, and finally, his masterclass in leadership.
Let's jump right into part 1, the ultimate ancient leader, covering the myth and the reality. And part 2, the real Cyrus cylinder, propaganda in clay.
To really get Cyrus, we have to recognize that different cultures basically built their own custom versions of him to fit their own needs. The Cyrus of the Babylonians is definitely not the Cyrus of the Greeks or the Hebrews. And to ground this all in reality, we have to look at the physical evidence, specifically his most famous artifact, the Cyrus cylinder. Discovered back in 1879 by Hormuz Drassam, you'll often hear it praised as this uniquely progressive document. But, well, historically speaking, it's actually a Neo-Babylonian building inscription. It was written by the priests of the god Marduk around 538 BCE. And as researchers point out, it wasn't even an original concept. The text was heavily modeled on much older Assyrian prototypes, like the foundation text of Ashurbanipal. Ultimately, it was traditional ancient Near Eastern royal propaganda cooked up by local priests to legitimize their brand new foreign ruler to the locals.
This is such a great example of the gap between myth and reality. The common assumption treats the cylinder as some kind of sweeping modern declaration of universal human rights, or a specific targeted edict to free Jewish exiles. But the reality? The actual text focuses almost entirely on Babylonian concerns. It's all about restoring local Babylonian deities to their shrines and fixing up local cults that the previous guy in charge had completely neglected. It frames Cyrus as the chosen tool of the Babylonian god Marduk to restore order to Babylon. So less modern human rights activist and more shrewd political restorer.
Moving on to part 3, a biblical savior, shifting narratives.
So, if the Cyrus cylinder was essentially Babylonian PR, how on earth did Cyrus become this legendary hero to the Hebrew people? Well, we actually get two very distinct biblical depictions of him. In the book of Isaiah, specifically chapters 40 through 48, Cyrus is framed primarily as the god Yahweh's military tool. He's this conqueror, someone from the east to just absolutely crush the Babylonians. In these earlier texts, there's no big focus on him building temples. But then, you flip over to the book of Ezra, chapters 1 through 6, and the narrative totally shifts. Ezra claims Cyrus explicitly ordered the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple and the return of their sacred vessels. It's a completely different job description, right? He goes from being a military hammer to this pious architect of the Hebrew faith.
Which brings up the big question. Did Cyrus actually order the temple in Jerusalem to be rebuilt? Well, looking at historical and biblical scholarship, it seems the heavy focus on bringing back Judean exiles and funding the temple reflects a much later, post-exilic ideology. It doesn't really align with Cyrus's actual day-to-day priorities back in 539 BCE. Aside from one heavily disputed half-verse in Isaiah, the older texts focus strictly on his military smackdown of Babylon. What likely happened is that the later authors of Ezra essentially co-opted Cyrus's massive imperial success for their own theological purposes. By linking the foundation of their second temple straight to the founder of the mighty Persian Empire, they give it incredible legitimacy.
Let's look at part 4. Alexander respects the tomb, a conqueror's idol. Now, the mythos of Cyrus didn't just stay in the Middle East. It spread westward like wildfire and completely captivated the Greeks and Macedonians. Just look at the timeline here, because it's pretty staggering. Cyrus dies in 530 BCE. Fast forward about 160 years, and the Greek writer Xenophon writes this massively influential biography about him. Then, in 334 BCE, Alexander the Great rolls into Asia and eventually reaches the Persian capital of Pasargadae. That is a 200-year gap between Cyrus dying and Alexander showing up. Yet Alexander had been obsessively reading about Cyrus since childhood and totally idolized his pragmatic, ultra-successful style of ruling.
So, picture this. Alexander finally arrives at his hero's tomb, which sat in this beautiful, lush grove of trees, and he finds an absolute disaster. The place had been totally ransacked by robbers. And according to the Greek historians who were right there traveling with Alexander, the tomb bore this incredibly powerful inscription. It read, "O man, I am Cyrus, son of Cambyses, who founded the empire of Persia and ruled over Asia. Do not grudge me my monument."
Alexander was understandably absolutely horrified by the desecration. The tomb robbers had basically just tossed Cyrus's body on the floor and damaged his magnificent gold coffin. So Alexander takes immediate action. He orders exact replicas made of all the stolen items. We're talking everything down to the specific Babylonian rugs and the gold coffin itself. He ensures the body is respectfully placed back inside and then completely seals the narrow entrance with stone and plaster so it could never be robbed again. He even tortured the Magi guards who dropped the ball on protecting it. It's this profound, almost reverent display of respect from one legendary conqueror to another, spanning centuries.
And finally, Part 5, the Master of Leadership, Lessons for Today. Okay, so we've seen the ancient leader, the propaganda, the biblical savior, and the conqueror's idol. But why should a modern executive, or really anyone leading a team today, care? What's the practical takeaway? Well, it all goes back to that guy, Xenophon of Athens. He was a student of Socrates and a legendary general in his own right. Back in 370 BCE, he wrote the Cyropapedia, which translates to the Education of Cyrus. It's a fictionalized, deeply philosophical biography of Cyrus that has literally served as a foundational text for leadership for over 2,000 years. Xenophon basically used Cyrus as a vehicle to explore the absolute hardest parts of managing other people.
Xenophon kicks off his book with this incredibly sharp observation about human nature. He notes that herd animals, think cattle, horses, sheep, they're a breeze to rule. You tell them where the grass is, they go graze. They don't form committees, they don't rebel. But humans are uniquely, stubbornly resistant to being ruled. And why is that? Because unlike animals who are just perfectly happy with food and a dry place to sleep, humans want complex things. We want honor, we want glory, we crave freedom. So we naturally push back and plot against the people trying to lead us. Looking at this dynamic, Xenophon originally came to the conclusion that ruling human beings is pretty much the most difficult, frustrating task on the planet.
But then, Xenophon looks at the sheer, mind-blowing scale of the Persian Empire. Here was Cyrus, commanding massive, wildly diverse populations across multiple continents, and they were all willingly following him. This historical reality totally forced Xenophon to throw out his pessimistic view. He realized that Cyrus actually proved a fundamental truth. Ruling humans isn't impossible. In fact, it's not even that difficult, but only if it is done with true knowledge.
So what is that knowledge? What was Cyrus's secret sauce? Xenophon mapped it all out, and honestly, it reads exactly like a top-tier modern management seminar. Cyrus was never just some brute force dictator. He showed incredible self-restraint over his own physical pleasures and emotions. He had intense personal discipline, this far-reaching, long-term strategic vision, and at his core, he was driven by a love for honor, a genuine love for humanity, and a constant, never-ending love for learning. He knew exactly how to balance ruthless, pragmatic political realism with a deep ethical responsibility to the people he actually governed.
Which leaves us with a pretty brilliant, incredibly relevant question to ask ourselves today. Whether you are leading a massive corporation, a local community, or just a small team at work, are you trying to rule your team like a herd of animals, just expecting them to blindly follow orders and go graze? Or are you leading them the way Cyrus did, with a true, nuanced understanding of human nature, genuinely honoring your complex desires for respect, freedom, and purpose? It's a 2,400-year-old lesson from Xenophon, but it absolutely still holds the key to true leadership today. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.